He rather dramatically exemplifies a consensus in modern conservative and liberal politics, one that Mark Fisher summed up perfectly in his book Capitalist Realism.
Is it the end of history? Is Jordan Peterson right?
That there is no alternative.
And this I think, is what capitalist realism is.
So, what actually is capitalist realism? Capitalist realism describes a widely held assumption in the modern age that the best way to conduct politics and economics is through the laissez-faire system of free market capitalism. And this belief is so deeply entrenched in the modern psyche that it is impossible to imagine a life without capitalism.
The illusion has become real. Capitalism at its finest.
Fisher quotes Frederick Jameson saying, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism." Fukuyama's thesis that history has climaxed with liberal capitalism may have been widely derided, but it is accepted, even assumed at the level of cultural unconscious. And a crucial element in how this was carried out is in propaganda. As Noam Chomsky demonstrates in Manufacturing Consent, projecting a caricature of communism was a major step in determining Western news framing. The essential ingredients of our propaganda model involve anti-communism as a national religion and control mechanism.
So this TikTok by Brendan Morris points out how Jordan Peterson really represents, more so than anything else, just the baseline anti-communism that exists in the United States of America, and to be honest, in a large part of the Western world, where there's this sort of assumption that capitalism is the only way that the world could ever possibly be organized. And a lot of it stems both from anti-communist Cold War propaganda and just ridiculous notions and ignorance about what socialism and communism is and what capitalism is. A lot of people, for example, will think the idea of markets themselves is inherently capitalist, that if people are buying or selling things, that must mean that there's capitalism. Except for, of course, feudalism is very different than capitalism, and there were still markets under feudalism, so it goes without saying that there might also be some markets in a socialist country as well. But let's really get down to it, because it just goes to show that people like Jordan Peterson don't really have any underlying ideology. Everything that they do is just centered around trying to justify existing power structure through whatever means they think is necessary. And that really is the core idea of these reactionaries, is to create this illusion that even though there's a mythical past that they want to go back to, at the same time, they don't want to actually change anything, because if they advocate for any type of larger systemic change, well, then that would imply that change is possible. That would imply that there might be some sort of possibility of systemic change on a grander scale. And they definitely don't want that, because what capitalism relies on more than anything else is the idea that capitalism is the only way to organize a society. This is actually why so many people go out of their way to try and say that China is a capitalist country, or to try and say that the USSR was never really socialist, because they want to create this illusion that capitalism is the only thing that's ever existed, despite the fact that capitalism has literally only been around for like 200 years tops. And so in that effort, you will basically see a lot of things being said about socialist countries to basically tell people, hey, even if you think capitalism is bad, those evil, scary socialist countries are worse, and you don't ever want to be like them. And so, yeah, capitalism might be terrible, but heaven forbid we have anything different because of how scary it is over there. But when you look at the arguments that they use, they fall apart pretty quickly. Like, for example, let's compare gulags in the USSR to prisons inside the United States of America. It turns out that not only did people in gulags actually get regular wages, like every other worker in the USSR, but they actually had a much lower mortality rate, and the sentences were much shorter than American prisons. Now, does that mean that everything was hunky-dory and was all perfect and fine and dandy? No, of course not. Like any other country, the USSR had its problems. Just like China today, the largest socialist country that's around, has its own problems and is a society. Nobody is running around saying that China is a utopia. But what we do point out is that if you look at the average conditions of living for the average worker, you see that the average worker in China has much more money left over as a percent of their income after their necessities are taken care of, just like workers in the USSR did compared to the United States of America. That on the whole, people have more vacation time, free time, stability in healthcare. They even have really cool public transit. All of these things that Americans really could only ever dream of. Because really, at the end of the day, what is socialism? Well, socialist theorists posit that the state is a tool of class oppression that can either serve the interests of of capital and suppress workers, or it can serve the interests of the workers and suppress capital. And so the big difference between a socialist country and a capitalist country in this sense is whether or not it has what is called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is also just known as a true democracy, because any real democracy will, by and large, represent the interests of working class people. And this is what really frustrates a lot of these capitalists who try and present this end of history myth. Because at the end of the day, a central component of like socialist philosophy and Marx's theory of dialectical materialism is that capitalists require monopolization of the economy in order for their economy to run. They just require this extreme amount of growth among the wealthiest in society in order to keep capitalism going, which means that as time goes, there will be less and less capitalists that are making more and more money, which means there will be more workers as a percent of the population who will want to fight for their interests, and at a certain point people will get fed up. And that's actually why they use this end of history myth so much, because they want regular people to think that there's no other option. And socialists dare to say that yes, there are other options to organize society. And the inherent tendency of capitalism is to bring about its own failure. Because as more people are forced in the position of working class people, as less people are given the opportunity to be business owners and stuff like that, more people will adopt the mindset of workers and fight for the rights of workers, things like unionization and stuff like that. Things like workplace democracy, and will naturally want to suppress capitalist exploitation because capitalist exploitation exploits them, the workers. And so this whole end of history thing is, at the end of the day, just bound to fail. But the longer people believe in this end of history, the longer it will take for capitalism to fall apart and be replaced with a socialist system. And so really the heart of this, the heart of what people like Jordan Peterson push, and really what both Democrats and Republicans push, is this baseline anti-communism, where they don't even care if you support capitalism. They just want you to be afraid of the word socialism.